Here we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is IDAGIO Live, which is the place where classical music happens. I haven't said that for a couple of months. That feels good. The place where classical music happens. And this is Song and Beyond, my foundation, the Hampson Foundation cooperation project with the IDAGIO.com streaming platform. If you haven't checked out IDAGIO, you might want to do that. It's not just streaming music. It's now IDAGIO Live, which is quite a catalog. And we're putting together a nice index for you of all the various programs we've had since last March. It's been some time now. And of course, the very exciting development in June, which was the Global Concert Hall, which is going crazy with all the presenters you can imagine in all of our various stages of lockdown and dependency on the digital realm, which is probably maybe not an all bad thing. We have developed this wonderful digital concert hall in which you can pay a ticket, very modest price, and watch it online, watch it live, and have a digital green room with the artists involved in that evening. And it's constructed and produced for people online, but also people, if it's possible, to have them in the hall. And I did a concert this summer, which we had a small public in safe seating to one another in Linz, I think it was. And so it's a wonderful development. It's an augmentation. I've been getting asked a lot of questions in interviews lately, whether the digital world of performance is going to replace performance. And of course it's not. By any means. There is nothing more important in all of our digital technical abilities over the years than enhancing, augmenting, and inviting people to the experience of live music, live performance, human beings communicating with other live human beings. There's nothing that can or will or even should attempt to replace that. But the digital world that we are now far more accepting and far more immediately involved in has some real advantages. And one of them is something like tonight. I can have wonderful conversations with colleagues and scholars and educators and administrators across the world about our passion for classical music and the world of classical music. And we're all safe and sound, and you're safe and sound. And yet, in an hour, you can turn this off and feel good about having taken part in a wonderful conversation. So instead of just having these two guys sit here with as talking heads on the camera, we have tonight in our wonderful program this month of Schubert, and why don't we do something about Schubert? It is January. It is Schubert month. And I have the wonderful pleasure of talking last week with Susan Joens and Graham Johnson, two wonderful song scholars. And this week, thank you very much to my very good friend, Morten Solvik, who we actually are probably better known with one another in the world of Mahler, but we're going to leave Mahler behind me. And tonight we have invited Morten's close colleague and my new friend and much admired scholar, Christopher Gibbs, to join us in a discussion of perhaps things you haven't thought about much of Schubert. So that's my lead in. And without much ado, gentlemen, maybe it would be just nice if you, I like calling it the 2.5 minute, self Wikipedia. Morten, why don't you go first? Who you are, where you came from, but especially focusing into why Schubert.
Well, I came to Schubert at a quite young age. My background is one of engagement in music as a young person. I was born in Norway, raised in the US. I went to college in the US. But the call to music called me to this city of Vienna, where I have been for 30 years. I have worked as a scholar in the area of Schubert, but also in Mahler, as you intimate. And my engagement is first and foremost, I think, indebted to a project that came my way as a musicologist. I finished my PhD and stayed in Vienna. Schubert, of course, being a city of Vienna, as the city of Vienna being a Schubert city, also one, of course, for Mahler. The project that came up was a very simple question: how did Schubert write his songs? I pursued this project for about 2 years and was drawn into not only Schubert's world, but how he worked on his music, and of course, this incredible miracle of his creativity.
You call that a simple question?
The question is simple. The answer is complex.
Okay.
I found many wonderful avenues to pursue once I went down that path.
Wonderful. Christopher, welcome.
Pleasure
Where are you from?
I'm from New York City, and that plays part of the story there because I really, my background was not as a performer or a composer, but as a concert goer. And by the time I was in high school, I was going to something almost every night at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center and the Met, and trying to think about really how I could have a life in music if I wasn't going to be performing on the stage. And so I got very interested in music history, majored in that at college, and then went to Columbia for my PhD. And that's how I really started the scholarly work on Schubert, growing out of a seminar paper, and that led to a dissertation on the reception of Schubert Lieder, primarily focused on the case of Erlkönig, his first and opus 1, these we'll talk about later. And it was fantastically good timing because the Schubert bicentennial in 1997 was coming up. And so a lot of projects and a lot of festivals and so forth, and sort of my investment in Schubert Futures paid off really well at this time, writing a dissertation on Schubert, particularly a fantastic project at the 92nd Street Y in New York City that was spearheaded by Hermann Prey. And the idea was to play every note that Schubert wrote over the course of 10 years and 100 concerts. It got sidetracked and went in different directions, but did take place for 10 years. And I was very involved with that and started, after finishing my dissertation, edited a collection for Cambridge University Press, then wrote a biography for them. And then eventually moved to, there it is, to Bard College and to teach at Bard College in New York State and also be the co-director with Leon Botstein of the Bard Music Festival. And that focuses each year on a specific composer and the world around that composer, beginning in 1990 with Brahms and now our 31st year. And for the 25th year, we did Schubert in his world, and Morten and I were the scholars who put that together and edited a book for Princeton, Schubert in his world. So I keep on coming back to Schubert, really no matter what other paths and other composers I'm exploring.
But in fact, Beethoven is a big cornerstone in your work, right?
In part coming out of Schubert because Beethoven was obviously the dominant figure in Vienna at the same time. Schubert's 27 years younger, but lives his entire life in Beethoven's Vienna, we might say, and just separated by 20 months, their death, and Schubert supposedly asking, and it did indeed happen, to be buried next to Beethoven, or as close as possible. The spaces in between were filled. But so I began to think more and more about the composer Schubert most revered and what perhaps connections and the entire musical culture of Vienna in that world.
You know, it seems to me, and we'll move on, but it seems to me we have this talk about Schubert, and immediately we sort of go back to Beethoven, and Beethoven is this monolith of everything. But when you talk about Mozart, that's like another generation, even though it's so close to it, it's a different conversation. Mozart in his world versus even Beethoven coming into it. You know, is that on your minds as well as historians and musicologists? Is it like that for you as well?
Well, Mozart had the misfortune as well of dying quite young, 35 rather than 31 as Schubert. You know, Haydn, who lived forever, so to speak, died in 1809, was really part of the very young Schubert's world. When Schubert is in school and singing in the Vienna Boys Choir and so forth, in the court chapel. So Mozart is certainly really another generation, but one of the rare writings of Schubert, he talks about the divine Mozart. It's one of the few composers besides Beethoven that he really is saying something about.
Well, I mean, Mozart sort of remained this god for composers through most of the 19th century, if not even to today.
When he writes that letter about the G minor symphony, of course, in the back of his mind, you can hear already his Fifth Symphony in B flat major, a clear homage to that Mozart piece, and of course the celebration of these two geniuses in one letter is an amazing document. There is one crossover, though, in popular imagination in any way. For a short time or for a while, Schubert's teacher was Salieri, and of course, very connection there in terms of popular mythology.
And it was Salieri that poisoned Mozart, right?
That's the one.
Yeah, I saw Amadeus. Come on, I thought everybody was already all the classicals were poo-pooing the movie. I thought it was fabulous. I loved it. I've seen it a couple times. My kids loved it. Anyway, guys, I want to move on. What I want to talk about tonight, I want to get into some weeds with you guys because you're the ones to do it. And I know there's a bunch of us, and you have led the pack to this myth busting of Schubert. And I think I'd like to talk about Schubert as a person briefly. I'd like to get that into a context of the politics and the time. And apropos Mozart, I mean, Mozart's dead at 91. The French and American revolutions are behind us. And yet we've got the rise of Napoleon, and we've got the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And we've got bombs landing in 1813, 12 in Vienna, which, Schubert's got to be affected by. And then we get into the sort of formats, the whole Carlsbad. I mean, there are a lot of sort of dark clouds hanging over this whole period. But first of all, just give me, both of you at will, fire at will, what have been predominant misconceptions of the physicality and emotionality of Franz Schubert?
Well, I would start by saying that it's very important to keep in context here how little we know about Schubert that comes from Schubert. So oftentimes what we know about composers comes from their letters and from diaries and from sometimes autobiographies. Wagner wrote 1,000 pages and just got up to his mid-30s.
What a surprise.
Right. So literally less than 100 Schubert letters survive, and most of them are relatively trivial. He really made just 3 big summer trips in his life, and that's when he sometimes wrote longer letters because there was a need to. And just a few scattered pages of diary entries, very, very, very little. So in the absence of his own writing, what assumes a great deal of importance is the memoirs and reminiscences by friends and family. And I would put that in sort of 2 categories. There were a whole bunch immediately after he died in 1828, very fresh sort of memorials and quite lengthy. And then his friends had the good luck, most of them, for living quite long lives, not dying at 31. And so 30 and 40 years later, when serious biographies are envisioned about Schubert, they're contacted, questionnaires are sent out, or other things are published. And they're now looking back really many, many decades, sometimes the same people. And it's fascinating to compare what they had said, in their 30s with what they're saying in their 60s. So I think the first thing around myths is there's a real absence of a lot of hard information, and therefore it's easier to make things up, and the myths of being neglected or so forth arise from that.
Is there a particular consistency of those reflecting on Schubert, or are there incredibly disparate remembrances? I mean, what you're referring to, the people recalling the friendship and talking about, have there been any controversies, or is there a relative consistent feeling about what he was like when people describe what he did and what he was like when he was doing it? Morten?
Any biography, any reflection on, especially if he's your friend, any reflection on Schubert is going to have a tragic cue. He died much too young. It's on his gravestone, with promises for much better things. This is the sense that he that he was just finding his stride when he died, and how tragic is that. But of course, he also suffered from syphilis, and he was a sick young man, and this adds to that the somber sort of tones of these recollections and of the facts of his biography. But there are many other aspects to what was actually going on in terms of his success as a public and certainly as a private composer, and the fact that he was looking forward to a productive life didn't mean that he hadn't already had one. Of course, that's very well known, writing almost 1,000 music.
And when we think, I mean, so many cliche ideas about Schubert is this rather lonely guy who liked to write songs and didn't have many friends, but liked to get drunk, and everybody called him Mushroom and Schwammel in German, which is a pretty awful nickname. I don't want to be called Schwammel. I suppose somebody probably call me Baum, which means tree, but never mind. We'll move on from that. But two things. First question. Extraordinarily talented, unbelievably musical. We have evidence of that, obviously in what he did, but also when people talk about him. Was he incredibly intelligent or just very intuitive? One. And two, what was his energy level like until until the sickness really started to grab a hold? Was he an energetic person? Was he an active person? He was a very loyal friend. It sounds to me, what I remember reading or about him, that if one crossed that line, that was it. But that line seemed to be pretty tolerant. He seemed to be pretty into his own imagination in a positive way, staying focused. How are those things lining up? What I'm saying.
Well, I think there's one nickname for Schubert that kind of says it all, and this nickname was another one that he had was Carnivas. And Carnivas in German means is he, what's his game? What can he do? Is he capable of something? And it shows, first of all, that he was very sharp and very attuned to what his colleagues were able to do, and that accomplishment was very much a focus in his own life. You can't produce this kind of, never mind the quality of the music, the quantity of this music, if you're not energetic and driven to produce, create. There are accounts of him falling asleep in bed with his glasses on because he was afraid he'd wake up with ideas, and he couldn't find his glasses quickly enough. So I mean, the fact that he was obsessed by creativity and energy and accomplishment, I think, says a lot out of that one nickname.
There were some later complaints and concerns that he didn't hang around with sort of the right people for being a professional musician, that most of his close friends were not professional musicians. They were writers and artists and civil servants. And so I think that points to this sort of intellectual world and the reading groups and what they were talking about and so forth. But there was some concern that if he had been hanging around with professional composers, that he would have gotten other types of skills and so forth. So I think that points to something of the intellectual world, and certainly the connection with literature and theater that plays such a large role in his music. And as Morten says, this productivity is just absolutely astonishing to just, when you see the collected edition and you think, how much time would it take with a quill pen and rough paper to just write it out, just copy it, let alone compose it, right? And in some years, like 1815, when he writes 150 songs and 2 symphonies and a mass and operas and so forth, it is mind-boggling of how much he is putting down on paper.
He didn't sleep much. Who knows? All those things, very interesting, Christopher. You're talking about, it makes perfect sense what you're saying, and we love it. When we, however, hear the term professional musician today, we certainly have a different immediate association to what it meant then. Maybe you guys, if you could take that professional musician, the private public concert life, and then maybe put the dark clouds of the politics on top of it, that would give us a nice setup to actually drill down into some of his works a bit later.
sometimes programs would say, you know, performed by a dilettante, and the same word, and we sort of, you know, pushed back from that, but it didn't have this pejorative connotation. It really was more that some of them just had their paid job as a civil servant, you know, meant that they were not making their money as a musician.
So the distinguisher professional meant that in some way or another, they were actually paying their rent and their wine because they were conducting, playing, scratching, singing, whatever they were doing. Some kind of work, but not a concert life like we know it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's important to point out that most music making was in homes, in parlors, in friends' houses. It was not a public musical life that we associate with today. In fact, that was just getting going in Vienna. The Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde had been founded, and the concept of going to a public concert was just finding its stride exactly when Schubert is hitting the scene as a 20-year-old in Vienna. So this is a very important concept that music making is largely in the private sphere, that music production was meant for so-called amateurs. It was also performed in Schubert's context with his friends, the so-called Schubertiade, where he is the centerpiece. But you know, he's playing dances for his friends while they dance. He's playing light piano pieces. He's accompanying his friends who are singing these songs. It's a very, very different world from the professional musicianship that we associate with today.
So these concerts are like in big living rooms, not even necessarily like salons that came along in Paris a little bit later. There's like big, fancy, what we call palaces, but they were just sort of Land or Stadtpalast, you know, big, beautiful homes.
Yeah, Beethoven was much more a part of the, you know, his literally aristocratic princes and so forth, right, that would be performing the Eroica Symphony, right, in a palace in Vienna. Right. Schubert's was more, we would call it middle class world. That's not right, quite the proper term, but you know, these really were lawyers and civil servants and so forth. And so yes, a big living room, and could be a couple dozen people to 100 people.
But a very active production life. I mean, it's still a very serious circuit to have you. In other words, where I'm going with this first is that one of the myths that we can, you know, we've already hit a couple of them, but is they never heard it in his music. And that's actually not entirely true.
Oh no, I mean, if you look at what he's producing, these were all performable and probably performed by his friends. We know that many of his songs, for instance, were circulated among his friends in copy. A fair number of his songs only survive in copy or because right, sent to a publishing house. So the idea that this was it's important to point out, it's not just an audience. This is something else. As people were performing too, but most people in that audience were also performers. So you might have a piano piece, you might have then someone reciting a poem, or someone creating a play, or maybe even asking people to come up with roles and inventing characters and so on. This is before the internet. This is before television. This was entertainment. This was the only way to spend time creatively. And one of the sort of an ethos of the time is Bildung, education, making the most of who you are and who you can be. And this took place in the context of the home, often also because of the political circumstances, which we haven't gotten to. But the notion of privacy and friendship was of a very, very high value at the time because of the political oppression that surrounded everybody. And so staying at home, doing your thing, getting educated, and celebrating friendship was a very large part of Schubert's life.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand this myth of that he wasn't hearing his music, because, and it allies with another, that he sort of was clueless, clairvoyant was the word used sometimes, and wouldn't be planning aspects of his career. So his first symphonies, beginning at the age of 16, were written for the school and community orchestra. We know they served the purpose, which was learning how to write a symphony. We know he heard them. He played in the orchestra. His friends played in it. His first string quartets were written for the family string quartet. Right. Literally, the part for the father was a little bit easier because he was not as good as Schubert's two brothers that were
I
also
wish my kids were that nice.
right. Well, so you know, these pieces were serving the purpose at the time, and later, when he's asked for an orchestral work for performance, he says he doesn't have anything. Well, he has many symphonies, but he's at a certain point changes to, now I am mature. These are works that I want to have performed and published, and they are by the top musicians. The Beethoven's string quartet, the most powerful chamber musician, Ignaz Schwanzig, had a regular series of about 24 concerts a season, and premiered Schubert's A minor string quartet, the octet, piano trio, and we know that Schubert went to these concerts, but also he was very elite company, since some 95% of the performances were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and Schubert was being added to that. So his career path, my colleague John Gingrich calls it Schubert's Beethoven project, how to become Beethoven genres, symphonies, string quartets, piano sonatas. 3 piano sonatas were published, but piano sonatas were not performed in public in recitals as we think of today, including Beethoven. So it's not like his, but 3 of them were published, and the last 3, he died before they were ready for.
It seemed like the dream he was really chasing seriously in the 20s before he died was the opera. You know, that was his ticket to, you know, the big composition. You know, the whatever. Is that right, or is it also symphony?
Well, he got off to a great start when he fought in 1821. You know, he had 2 productions that were running, Zauberhof and Zwillingsbrüder, and you know, at major theaters. Neither of them turned out to be much of a hit, and he struggled for a long time. I mean, he produced many operas that never saw the light of day during his time. But that was sort of, you know, as a careerist, you know, when you're in your early 20s, okay, how am I going to make it big? Everybody loves my songs. I've written a lot of, you know, vocal music. How can I make it big? Well, I'll be an opera composer. And of course, that was the goal of many a composer at that time. He never made his break. And it's very interesting to see that around the time that he's starting to get recognition, late teens, early 20s, he is struggling to come up with, you know, the new me, you know, that I did in my sleep now are not what I want to do. I want to hit some of the more important genres. So after opera, he does actually, in a sense, put that aside and move more towards piano sonata, piano trio, symphonies.
And his career was getting publicly much stronger already by 25, 26, meaning 1825, 1826. I mean, he died before the wave could have actually crashed. All right. I mean, that is also tragic because he really was starting to find a public for his music.
Well, he had given a very big concert, the most important of his career, on the 26th of March, 1828, which is significant because it was the exact first anniversary of Beethoven's death. And it was reviewed in the context of Beethoven as well. And it was a great success. And the centerpiece of that was the E-flat trio. That was his first big work published outside of Vienna, in Leipzig. And so I think it was all headed very, very clearly in that direction. The opera, you're absolutely right, was a disappointment, but that even has some explanation in the explosion of Rossini mania and of Italian opera, and actually the failure of Ariante by Carl Maria von Weber in German. So German opera had reasons for optimism with Der Freischütz of Weber, and he was commissioned then to write an opera for Vienna, which was Ariante, and that flopped. And that's exactly the time that Schubert realizes he's written these 2 big German operas, and they're probably not going to succeed in the wake of Weber's failure and Rossini's. And everybody loved Rossini. Schubert as well, right? Yeah.
Let me just move a little bit in another direction. That is that before we go into the individual politics, one thing that's always bothered me, you know, studying music history, and especially being the hobby Germanist that I am and all that, Germanophile, is this word Biedermeier. And I've come to, we use it in today's vernacular mostly as a severe criticism of extremely simple people. And whatever that worth of it, that word is, I don't want to get into much, but we know that the Biedermeier period, or this, what got hooked over this period, was of this intense home life. But I think the intense home life is directly related to the politics of the time. There wasn't a little bit like the life we're living in right now. You don't have a lot of choice. Stay home, stay off the street, stay out of the restaurants, save your social living. It was certainly far more drastic. I don't mean to be glib or stupid and compare the COVID crisis to the Metternich regime, but I think we underestimate what this home life really meant to the friend circle, the way they associated with one another, and the way they spoke in such heavy laden symbols and metaphors to communicate probably what would have been considered either heretical or certainly seditious ideas. And we don't need to get into Joseph Sen stuff, but if you could set up, with that preamble, if you could take us down that private life and in the context of Metternich's Vienna that is dominating all of these boys' lives, that would be very helpful. Who wants to go? Have I made any sense what I just said?
I think we can both go, but I think Schubert was very much cautious, careful. The whole episode with Sen shows that when he got mad, he could berate an officer as well and get into trouble, but he never crossed the line. However, he and his friends were sort of bucking some of those restrictions. He was a member of, as we know, the Unsinnsgesellschaft, the Nonsense Society, where they made fun of a lot of local personalities and sort of slight allusions to the politics of the time and certainly of new inventions and so on. And they were having fun in a subversive but non-threatening fashion. So he was aware of that, and he was trying not to cross the line. But also, I think there's a certain resentment. One important letter, and I know Christopher will want to talk more about this, was in 1824. He's writing to his friend Kupferwieser, who is in Italy, and he says, "I can finally write you now my thoughts." And you're thinking, well, why is he saying I can finally write my thoughts? Because letters were censored. Letters were
exactly
accepted and read. And the reason he can finally express himself is because he gave it to a friend who was on his way to Italy. And so he knew it wouldn't be opened. And so that just one little sentence in there sort of reveals the entire mentality of avoiding authority.
But I mean, in the early 20s, they talk about a double whammy of church and state. You couldn't come across the border into Austria with your own private books without them being inspected, whether they were books to be allowed across the border. Can you imagine? End of Amazon. But
yeah, we don't
Christopher, something on your mind.
Exaggerate too much our thoughts of censorship and political repression and so forth, and we begin to think of what Shostakovich deals with in Soviet Russia and so forth. But it really was, after the Congress of Vienna, by a few years later, very strict practical things of getting things published. It had to have the censor's mark, holding public events. So some of this thing of literally presenting a concert, you had to get permission to do it.
Right.
The Vienna Philharmonic didn't exist. There wasn't a dedicated concert hall yet in Vienna. So there are other things that are sort of making it a little bit more difficult, but they're just the practicalities of it. Even when Beethoven premieres the Ninth Symphony as 3 movements of the Missa Solemnis on it, but he has to call them hymns, not parts of a mass, because you weren't allowed to be performing mass in a secular situation like that. So there were lots of things they were dealing with, and that means sort of a retreat into the home. And what Morten's referring to of this Johann Zen affair is in March of 1820, so Schubert's 23, and there was the social gathering. The police came in, and the person that it was at Zen's house that suffered the most was Zen, who was exiled then from Vienna, and Schubert never saw him again. So there really were consequences to these actions as well. Wasn't being sent off to a gulag and put to death, but your actions you had to take seriously.
Well, it's actually a pretty tragic story. I mean, one usually just tells that story, but actually Sen, living in the area of Innsbruck, is essentially starving to death and being starved and not allowed to work and not allowed to even follow his own profession. I mean, they just bloody well killed him. That's all there's a question about. Metternich, I think, comes into the picture. He's appointed chancellor in 1818, I think, 1818, 1819. And this cloud, this repressive cloud, sort of sits over, and it goes towards formats. How is there some way, Christopher? I do want to have you talk about Erlkönig and Goethe and the beginning of the songs. But Goethe lives. When did Goethe die?
1832.
Exactly. So I mean, how are these arcs of these different major picture? What I'm going for is it's fun to hear you guys talk about this, because we tend to think of things like this when actually life is like this. And it's like I'm always wrongly dating the Symphonie Fantastique. We just think, oh, Berlioz 1830 what? No, well, actually no. What is this shadow and genius of Goethe? We probably all know some superficial part of the story of his friend sending some Schubert settings of Schubert of Goethe poems to Goethe, and it's being replied back. But that's just kind of anecdotal. Is there a way to tie those two things up? If there isn't, just go for Goethe.
Well, I would start by saying that Schubert, in his over 600 songs, set about 100 different poets, from friends, and really trivial and sort of party things, to the greatest poets of the past and contemporaries, Schiller and Goethe. And the poet he set most often was Goethe, and also that was the genius who really fired his imagination for his first masterpieces. Gretchen am Spinnrade, from Gretchen at the Spinning Wheel, from Faust, which he dated. He dated many of the manuscripts. As Morten says, many are lost, but in this case, it's the 19th of October, 1814. So he's 17 years old, and that date is sometimes called the birthday of the German Lied, because it just explodes of what happens. And then within a year is Erlkönig, and they're subsequently published in 1821 as his opus 1 and 2. And so this great poetry fired his imagination, particularly during these years. And all these miraculous things happen. So in both of those songs, the spinning wheel that is being depicted by the piano, or the storm in the ride that's being depicted in Erlkönig, we could say that that's sort of tone painting. But that happens in Die Forelle. You get in the trout, you hear the water and so forth. But this goes back to the Middle Ages and Renaissance and madrigals and operas and so forth. But what Schubert's doing is something that is, yes, it's depicting a spinning wheel or depicting a ride, but also it connects with the psychology of both of these poems. So the spinning wheel is going on until, as the poem has it, Gretchen is thinking of Faust's kiss. And at that point, the spinning wheel stops, and there's sort of this ecstasy, and it starts up again. So he perfectly gets the psychology of the poem through using this realistic detail in these fantastic piano accompaniments that are also much more difficult to play, I would say, than most of these earlier composers that he had been modeling his lead career on. Some of the people you talked about last week, Zelter and Reichardt and Zumsteck.
Zumsteck especially, yeah. What apropos of the instrument, quickly letting you go on with your what role does the development of the piano, because the pianoforte turning into the piano is really at a pretty serious development stage at this point. I mean, it's every year there's a new kind of action and a new kind of sound. What was the ideal that they were after? The action or the acoustic?
Well, I imagine it would be a bit of both. And of course, there was a Vienna mechanic. There was a different mechanic in London. There are different ways of creating basically the effect of hitting the key. But as these things became more refined, it was possible to become more adroit, to play more quickly. And of course, the sound volume grew over time as well. I can't stress how important the piano was to that salon that we just talked about. There were probably 100 piano manufacturers in Vienna by the time we get into the 18.
And is that just because everybody's buying a piano?
Everybody's buying a piano.
A house without a piano is just not thinkable.
Sorry?
A house without a piano just was not unthinkable.
No, for those families that stressed that kind of education, Bildung,
Right.
that in their lives, it's like having a fancy car in your driveway. You come into this salon and there it is. The piano. It means I've got money, I've got time, I have culture. So this was very, very important part of the time. And Vienna attracted an incredible number of piano manufacturers.
Yeah, it's where the home entertainment center is now, of the flat screen TV and so forth. And as similar as with computers and with TVs, the price comes down. It becomes easier to afford one, and they become better. And every few years, the computer is twice as fast. The piano action, the ability that it can do. It still takes some more decades, even after Schubert's death, when Liszt, who we think of as the first great piano virtuoso, his concerts, he would have sometimes multiple pianos on the stage because the strings would be breaking under him playing his transcription of Erlkönig.
Have you been to the Liszt Museum in Budapest?
Yes.
And you see his hands. You see all these pianos in different parts of the room. I love his traveling piano. Just like a 14-key keyboard and a writing desk. I mean, it's incredible. Look, Christopher, you referenced at the very beginning about this wonderful Schubertiade at the 92nd Street Y in New York, and I'm a big fan of the 92nd Street Y. And I remember being there. I was a guest of Ernst Hielmar, who was one of the directors of the whole thing. And I remember we had a very long day one Saturday on everything Erlkönig, which culminated in a very enlightened guest part of the public raising his hand at the end of 8 hours of Erlkönig. The solemn hand came up with a question. He said, "So, which one's the best?" Because I think we'd heard something like 14 or 15 or 25 doing it. What I want to ask is, I've always, as a singer, been really fascinated with the development of the piano. And I think that there's actually an area of recording and even musicology that could stand to be fleshed out a little bit. It's not enough just to get on one of those old sewing machines and play on it. I think I'd love to match repertoire to piano and get into the graph. Mahler owned a Graf quadruple string Graf piano, and the Bechstein development and the Bösendorf, all of that. There are essentially 4 extant versions of Erlkönig from Schubert. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
Do you think they had anything to do with the development of the piano?
There are really not terribly significant differences, except for one that is simplified. Duplets and it does seem that Schubert was a pianist. That was his principal instrument, but he was not Mozart or Beethoven as a virtuoso. And he did perform on a limited number of times in public accompanying. But the anecdotal remarks are that Erlkönig or the Wanderer Fantasy was sort of beyond his abilities to perform in public. So actually the premiere of Erlkönig in the public was played by his friend Anselm Hüttenbrenner So there is a simplified version, but all of these manuscripts are from around the same time, and it would have been the same instrument, I think, for him thinking about it. It's not that he came back 5 years later and said, let me improve it because the piano has changed.
I was watching a talk with Daniel Barenboim that he was giving about Beethoven online, also from the Boulez Hall, really wonderful. And he says in there that, you know, the really masterful, great composers are very often hearing, at the height of hearing a music and very often instruments that don't exist. And they are the predecessors of what then one creates to make the sound that actually they imagine. Is there some of that in Schubert?
I don't know. I think sometimes he gets away with almost fooling you into believing that about what he had at his disposal. I think he was very comfortable with the sonority of the piano and could, as we know, work wonders with it. Evocative of feelings from, you know, joy to despair. I don't think of him as needing, you know, another form of accompaniment. Although of course they had guitar and others that were sometimes used in his pieces. But as far as the lead repertoire is concerned, I think he was quite happy with and incredibly capable with that sonority. What do you think?
What do you think a Schubert would think if he came back today and somebody said, "Oh, here's a Bösendorfer we'd like to give you, and have a whack"? what do you think these guys would do with their modern instruments today? Would it be exciting, or probably so loud it would give them a headache? But
well, one would really love to know what Bach would think about the Goldberg variations, because the harpsichord's a complete, you know, at least all of the definition of pianoforte, of the soft, loud machine, is that how you press the key will have an impact on the volume, right? But the harpsichord doesn't work that way. And so the possibilities for shading and dynamics that was Bach's world is something that changes very, very dramatically. So that's the type thing I've always, you know, what would he think of Glenn Gould and the Goldberg variations on a Bösendorfer?
You know, as we keep getting older, 8 generations, we get, I mean, literally farther away from Schubert. It's, you know, we've had some pretty serious revisionist ideas about songs and poems. I mean, apropos König, König, I think just literally within the last 18 months, there's been a very provocative article in German about the actual symbology of the poem being more towards child abuse and disturbing relationships with parents and all that kind of stuff. I mean, does some of that stuff, and I suppose when I say some of that stuff, it already sounds pejorative from me. I do read it and I try to keep up with it. I have a hard time weeding through it because I just think that König is a fairy tale for a purpose. But it's a little bit like the reawareness to Grimm's fairy tales and turning them into, you know, incredibly psychotic landscapes. Do you see that coming up in Schubert research? Are we going too far? You know, it's like, you know, should we analyze Bugs Bunny? You know, I'm not calling Schubert Bugs Bunny, but are we going too far? Or have you been confronted with things that just seem essentially deconstructionist?
Sure, and I have a somewhat more sympathetic view towards, it can be in readings of Shakespeare plays or of whatever, that, you know, you read Shakespeare after Freud differently. You read after reading Marx, after feminist criticism, queer studies. You know, it gives lots of different windows. I don't have much sympathy that this is now the answer. We've cracked the code to Hamlet because, you know, we've read Freud.
Fair enough.
But I think it does give other insights that we wouldn't have perhaps thought about without these lenses. I'll say that some of the sort of more trendy readings age rather quickly and you know, are forgotten about and look silly within a few years. but great psychoanalytic readings, I would say, of various
Okay.
works of literature have, remained quite compelling.
I think I would largely agree with what Christopher is saying. I think it depends on the claim that's being made. I think if you want to say this is the work and how it operates in our culture and subjected to that kind of analysis, there's a legitimacy to that. But to take our reading back to the author in this case, or the composer, I think is a very, very dangerous and slippery slope. I think that would be going too far. If we think about it in historical terms, the sad truth is infant mortality was rampant. Little children dying on the way somewhere was not infrequent. And as we know from Schubert's family, this was a very common occurrence. So I think the reality, if there's a reality here, historically speaking, that might be reflected in all of this. Of course, it's this mystical Erlkönig, but it's also, unfortunately, the reality of infant mortality. But again, that's only one reading, and it's an historical. Yeah. We can talk about that viably, but what else do you want to make of it? Just don't make the same claim. That's all I would say.
If you've written your dissertation on Erlkönig, was it on Erlkönig or on everything around it, or? Well, and
primarily that song, yes.
And what was and I mean, obviously we don't have time for your whole dissertation, but I have a feeling there may be a few more layers of this onion to peel before we leave it. What was that drill down like? What are we listening to? What are we missing with Erlkönig or even with Gretchen and some of the other Goethe? Is there a facet to the Goethe oeuvre with Schubert that is elemental? Or, take us through that.
Well, what I used it as something of a case study in multiple respects that I thought would be helpful for understanding Schubert as well, and the genre of the Lied. Because it is a work that sort of changes the history of of the Lied. Schubert was known in many contemporary sources as the composer of Erlkönig. It's sort of his label, right? And brings him his fame, and then spreads through an enormous number of reworkings and transcriptions and orchestrations, most significantly by Liszt, who was the rock star of the time. And from 1838 to 48, he toured almost continuously for a decade. So if he was in St. Petersburg or Dublin or Spain, and he was playing his real hit, which was his transcription for piano alone of that song, that might be the first time that the name Schubert would be known to. And he orchestrated it, Berlioz orchestrated it, and there are well over 100 transcriptions and reworkings that I was exploring sort of the mechanics of this. And then the poem itself has been set by 100 different composers. Reichardt and Zelter had said it before Schubert. Beethoven started, he diverted the music to another piece, and somebody's done a sort of completing it for him, but that doesn't really count. And then people after, Louis Spohr does one with a violin obbligato for the Erlkönig coming in and so forth. And you're singing on your recital a really great setting, the Löwe, the Karl Löwe.
I love it.
And that's been a debate about those two, the sort of Coke and Pepsi taste test of the German Lied. Both were Opus 1 for these two composers. And Löwe was particularly associated with the genre of the ballad, which tells a story, as we know. Schubert actually set very few ballads. Der Zwerg, the dwarf, which you're doing as well on one of these concerts, is one of the others. But this was something that Löwe specialized in. And some people think it's much more, it's the authentic ballad. He gets it righter in that respect. Right. Wagner was a great fan of Löwe's setting. And I don't know whether you've ever thought about it, but there's sort of a little bit of the Ride of the Valkyries in some of the interludes. That's right.
Yeah, I was just working on it this afternoon. I think it's a marvelous setting. I think they're both original G minor.
That's right.
In the original key. I mean, and Schubert certainly didn't know about Löwe. There's a question out there whether Löwe might have known about Schubert. but it seems to be kind of an amazing coincidence in musical history somehow. Wonderful settings. I think it's quite fun, and I separate them by a Löwe song, another great masterpiece by Goethe, Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe, but also Löwe, beautiful setting. What else can we? We're at an hour. I want to let you go, but I don't want to let you go. I mean, how often do I get to have this kind of conversation? How often does our public get to have guys like you talk about the ins and outs of things? Morten, we've talked so much about different things, but I think the other day we were tipping across Schubert and manuscripts and late pieces, and we're going to have to do a different show. We'll do a different show next year when we do actually look at the Kosegarten. And actually this question of, it also comes up with the opus numbers. I'm doing a thing on that this year as well. You know, the opus numbers are the pieces that Schubert put together. You know, are they little cycles? Do they belong together? Graham mentions that there's this cyclic tendency or desire, I want to say in German, Drang, I don't know what that is, drive, to sort of tie and hook things up together, which I think is very legitimate for Schubert. What was you were talking about? You're talking about the Relstab situation, right? Some of the last songs in Taubenpost and all that.
The Die Taubenpost kind of encapsulates so many of the issues that you're alluding to here. Die Taubenpost being the last song that Schubert worked on. And it was published together with the Relstab and Heine settings as Schwanengesang by Tobias Haslinger just a few months after Schubert's death. And it's led to, of course, a lot of discussion and controversy. You know, first of all, the song doesn't belong there conceptually and musically in terms of that set. And so the question is, what's it doing there? Well, it wasn't Schubert's doing, it was Haslinger's doing. We're not even sure exactly how he got the manuscript, but he, you know, you have to remember Haslinger was a businessman, not a musicologist. So his job was to sell as many copies of this publication as he could. And of course he had a real scoop, you know, the last Schubert songs, and he wanted to present them. But, you know, you look at the Relstab settings followed by the Heine settings, and, you know, the last one in that being the Doppelgänger, going to Taubenpost, you know, that's a little bit of a hard turn right there.
I can't do it.
and so, you know, today to today's ears, that's really maybe something we're not going to easily accept. However, if you think of it in terms of selling these things, the depressing ending of something wasn't something Haslinger wanted to sell, and he had a sort of rationale here. Die Taubenpost is about a messenger. Well, if you look at the Schwanengesang, what's the first song? Liebesbotschaft. So it's also a messenger. So in a sense, those two topics form the arc of those 14 songs. Now the title, Schwanengesang, the 14 being together, is not Schubert's doing.
No.
The one interesting thing about Taubenpost, however, is also the fact that it has a sketch, and a fairly well-developed sketch, as do some of the other settings that I just mentioned. So what are these sketches doing? You know, if we look through Schubert's song manuscripts, there are very few sketches really from most of his life, and yet there's a preponderance of them at the end of his life. This is an indication of yet something that we've just talked about when Christopher mentioned the lack of evidence. Well, in the case of sketches, the lack of evidence is simply the wearing away and the throwing away of sketches over Schubert's lifetime. So, does he start sketching at the end of his life to, you know, compose differently? No, that really seems very unlikely. It seems that he would have sketched through most of his creative life, and the fact that he died so quickly, and what was left over was simply handed, you know, was taken over by his brother, and that's what we inherited, historically speaking. So the lack of evidence doesn't mean it never existed, obviously. It's
right.
It's quandary. Those sketches, in all likelihood, were there, but we'll never know. We'll never have them, I guess, is the better answer.
Yeah, I personally find the Heine songs just of such another universe of tone painting and if that's the right word, or setting of poetry. You know, it just seems that he was going in a completely different direction. I mean, I've often asked that question, you know, what do you think, what would Schubert have been like if he just managed to live to be 50? You know, like Schubert, like Weil and Gershwin and Mahler, you know, just get him to 50. you know.
Well, these are the only Heine settings by Schubert. Buch der Lieder had just been published. Was a match made in heaven. As we know, Schumann, of course, did amazing things with Heine as well, and in that set. So that's another aspect of, what is this triggering in his mind? Where could he go with this material?
Well, I think it's a very legitimate argument that Schumann, who is profoundly devoted to Schubert and apparently wept and was very, it was a catastrophic event with Schubert's death. But there's just no question that the Heine settings of Schubert propelled Schumann into his massive settings. Anyway, I don't know.
It's interesting that Schumann is 18 years old and, living in North Germany. And yes, he cries when he hears that Schubert had died. So it shows how things really are.
How did he know Schubert? How did he know of Schubert?
Well, it shows how widely published it was, and actually through Friedrich Wieck, Clara's father, and his piano teacher, there was a performance of the E-flat piano trio that was being published the month that Schubert died. The late letters of how Schubert is aching for this publication to come, and it's a few months behind, and he's desperate to see it, and he keeps writing to the publisher. And my guess is it literally missed by about a week since Schubert died on the 19th of November.
Unbelievable. Gentlemen, we're gonna wrap it up. I want you, if there's a myth about Schubert, it's the relevance of Schubert. And we've all gone through various celebrations and we've all had our interviews, and inevitably someone will say, so what does Schubert mean to us today? And I always feel like the question is upside down. What can we understand of Schubert in his day? And I mean, he lived his life and he said his thing. It's our responsibility to understand that. But I guess it's a big general question. If either one of you would like to jump on this as we close out, why is it important to study Schubert and Schubert song in general? Why do you think it's important?
Well, if I can
feel free to preach to the choir.
I've had a gimmick for 35 years or so of teaching many of my courses, from sort of clapping for credit music 101 to non-majors to courses on romanticism, of beginning with On die Musik, which Schubert wrote at the age of 20. It's his ode to music. The words are by his best friend, Franz von Schubert. And I just say I'd like to begin the semester by playing this piece. It's written by somebody that's your age. His best friend wrote the words. And, this is about music. Now, I did that this semester, teaching in a tent outdoors at Bard during a pandemic, wearing masks, the students wearing masks. And let me tell you, we heard this song in a different way, this theme song of Schubert, where it talks about the importance of this holy art and of these sweet chords and how it takes us to a better place. And, this is the importance of music. And this lead, by the 20-year-old Schubert captures it in a way that is absolutely phenomenal. And it shows about how we listen in different ways at different times. And listening to that piece, in September of this year in these circumstances, was answering the question for me.
Yeah, I get it. Morten.
Before you said that, Christopher, the first word that comes to my mind is gratitude. It popped into my head, and that song, if anything, is saying thanks. It's saying thanks to music, and I say thanks to these incredible geniuses who gave to humanity that kind of ability and the miracle of going to a place that is so rare and so fundamental at the same time. And I feel just deeply humbled and thankful for someone like Schubert.
Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful hour. We've gone a little bit over, but as we usually do. One of the great pleasures of this series that I took on as a friend and just thought it'd be good in the COVID crisis, and now has become a way to communicate and share with major scholars and performers, But if there's anything I love, it's one, helping experts do what they do really well, giving them a platform to have it happen. My next passion is, of course, giving the generations behind me any and every possible performance platform and possibility they can possibly have. It is my motto is, without question today in my life, ennoble, empower, and embrace the next generations. But I also love having these scholars and colleagues that have meant so much to my own personal development, my own knowledge, to be able to have this conversation for you, the people who, when you hear the musicologist, you either wrinkle your nose or shrink back. It's Paul Patrick, anybody in education, but actually to have these guys get emotional and talk about such specific details of such unbelievable accuracy in a genius we can only wonder at, and yet in such a human way for themselves, and to make something as seemingly so distantly extraordinary as a Franz Schubert someone you'd like to invite for dinner. Hopefully he'll play afterwards. This is one of my great privileges. And this Schubert month, I'm just in seventh heaven, talking with all these friends and colleagues and celebrating this extraordinary moment in our civilization. It happened to be on the shoulders of a very short, somewhat round, incredibly interesting and generous human being called Franz Schubert. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Do come, by the way. Boulez Saal, we've turned everything digital every night at 8 o'clock Central European time, which means you should watch it the next day online. We will have concerts at the Boulez Saal from the 18th of January to the 25th or 24th of January. 8 o'clock every night is a different concert. And on the weekend, the 22nd, 3rd, and 4th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, will be live classes, well, 2 live classes. And on Sunday will be the final concert of the ones that have been studying for a week. And this is actually a culmination over a year of these particular young colleagues being under my fingers and admonishing physicality and singing, whatever, you get the drift. But do join us in the Boulez Saal Schubert Week. We'd love to have you there. It's free. So, and it will all stay online for a certain amount of time, certainly for a couple of weeks, so you can revisit it. I promise you will hear more Schubert songs in an 8-day period than anywhere else in the world, maybe since the 92nd Street Y. It's been a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you for joining us. I will see you Song and Beyond, IDAGIO.com, where classical music happens. I see you next Tuesday, which, by the way, will be live from the Boulez Saal with all of these extraordinary young singers I've been talking about. We're going to have a nice round table with 12 different singers. That'll be loud and confusing, but a lot of fun. See you then. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Hang on. We'll let the public go. And